For over a century, the world has told the same story about Albert Einstein, a German Jew, a man born into the Ashkenazi intellectual tradition of Central Europe, a physicist whose identity was so thoroughly European that the Nazis built an entire propaganda campaign around destroying him. His family had lived in Germany for generations. His father Hermann ran a small electrical engineering company in Munich. His mother Pauline played piano and filled the house with Beethoven. They were assimilated, educated, middle-class German Jews, and that identity was never questioned. Not by historians, not by biographers, not by Einstein himself, who once wrote that his bond to the Jewish people was the strongest human connection he had ever felt. The story seemed airtight. Then, a genetics laboratory in Zurich ran a haplogroup analysis on Einstein's paternal lineage, and the results pointed somewhere no one expected. To understand why those results matter, you have to understand how settled Einstein's origin story was. He was born on March 14, 1879 in Ulm, in the Kingdom of Württemberg in what would become unified Germany. His father Hermann Einstein was born in Buchau, a small Swabian town with a well-documented Jewish community dating back centuries. His mother, Pauline Koch, came from Cannstatt, near Stuttgart. Both families were Ashkenazi Jews, the Central and Eastern European Jewish population that had lived in the German-speaking world since the medieval period. The Einstein surname itself had a paper trail. German law in the early 19th century required Jewish families to adopt fixed hereditary surnames, and many chose names derived from local geography. The Einstein family name almost certainly traces back to the Bavarian village of Stein, or possibly to the hamlet of Einstein, a place you could point to on a map. That was how grounded the family's German identity was. Their very name was a product of German law, German geography, and German bureaucracy. Tracing the paternal line further back, historians identified Einstein's great-great-grandfather as Rupert Einstein, a Jewish farmer from Swabia. His great-great-great-grandfather on another branch, Jakob Weil, was a Jewish merchant from Westhausen, born in 1818. The records were consistent. The lineage moved through small Swabian towns, through the tight-knit Jewish communities of Württemberg, generation after generation. Birth records, marriage certificates, community tax rolls. The documentation was not thin, it was thorough. Every genealogist who looked at the Einstein family tree came to the same conclusion. This was an Ashkenazi Jewish family, rooted in the German-speaking world, with no obvious connection to anywhere else. And Einstein himself seemed to confirm it through his life choices. He rejected German nationalism. He embraced Jewish intellectual culture. He helped found Hebrew University in Jerusalem. When the Nazis rose to power in 1933, they stripped him of his German citizenship and labeled his physics Jewish science. He fled to Princeton, New Jersey, and never returned to Germany. His entire biography was framed around that identity, the German Jew who escaped the country that tried to erase him. But the DNA told a different story. The anomaly surfaced not from a dramatic archival discovery, but from a quiet scientific process. In the early 2000s, iGenea, a Zurich-based genealogical genetics institute, began building DNA profiles for historically significant figures using samples obtained from living, verified descendants. The methodology was careful. The institute cross-referenced paternal line descendants, individuals who could document an unbroken male lineage back to the Einstein family, and used their Y-chromosome samples to construct a genetic profile of Einstein's paternal haplogroup. The expected result was straightforward. Ashkenazi Jewish men cluster heavily into a small number of Y-chromosome haplogroups. Haplogroup J, and particularly its subclades J1 and J2, accounts for a large proportion of Ashkenazi paternal lines, consistent with a founding population that traced back to the ancient Levant. Haplogroup E1b1b also appears in the Ashkenazi population, but at lower frequencies. Most geneticists would have placed their prediction on a J subclade. The result came back as E-PF1952, a specific subclade within haplogroup E1b1b, and that single data point opened a question that no biography of Einstein had ever asked. To understand what EPF1952 means, you have to understand what Y-chromosome haplogroups actually track. The Y-chromosome passes from father to son, almost completely unchanged across generations. Every man alive today carries a Y-chromosome that is a near-perfect copy of one carried by an ancient ancestor thousands of years ago. Haplogroups are the branches of that ancient tree, defined by specific mutations that occurred at specific points in human prehistory and then spread as populations moved across the Earth. Haplogroup E1b1b originated in Northeast Africa. The broader E lineage is one of the oldest on the human Y-chromosome tree, and its B1b branch spread north and east over tens of thousands of years into the Horn of Africa, across North Africa, into the Levant, and eventually into southern Europe via two main routes, through Egypt and the Sinai into the ancient Near East, and across the Mediterranean into the Iberian Peninsula and Italy. Today, E1b1b is found at high frequencies in Ethiopia, Somalia, Egypt, Libya, Morocco, among Berber populations, among Levantine populations including Jews and Arabs, and in parts of southern Europe, particularly Sardinia, Sicily, and the Balkans. It is not and has never been a primarily Central European lineage. But here was Einstein's paternal DNA sitting squarely within it. Dr. Doron Bahar, a geneticist at Rambam Medical Center in Haifa who has extensively studied the genetics of Jewish populations, has noted that E1b1b appears in the Ashkenazi Jewish community at frequencies between 18 and 20%, a meaningful proportion but not the dominant lineage. What is significant about the E1b1b presence in Ashkenazi men is where it likely came from. Population genetic studies, including the landmark 2010 study published in Nature by Bahar and colleagues, traced the Ashkenazi founding population back to the ancient Levant, modern-day Israel, Lebanon, Syria, and Jordan. The E1b1b lineage in Ashkenazi Jews is consistent with ancestry from this region, potentially stretching back to the ancient Israelite population of the southern Levant, or to the broader Near Eastern groups with whom ancient Israelites lived, traded, and intermarried. That meant Einstein's paternal DNA was not a product of medieval Germany. It was not a product of Swabia or Württemberg or the tight-knit Jewish communities his family had lived in for centuries. It was a genetic echo of something far older, a lineage that had walked out of Africa, settled in the Levant, and eventually, through pathways still being reconstructed, arrived in the German-speaking world wearing a surname derived from a Bavarian village. But the question no one had answered yet was how. The migration history of E1b1b into the Levant and its eventual presence in European Jewish communities is not a single story. It is a layered one built across thousands of years. The earliest evidence of E1b1b in the Levant dates to prehistoric periods, long before the emergence of any of the civilizations we recognize. By the Bronze Age, populations carrying this lineage were present across a broad arc from the Nile Delta to the Euphrates. The ancient Israelites, as a population, were not genetically uniform. They absorbed Canaanites, Egyptians, and other Near Eastern groups. They were exiled to Babylon and returned. They traded with Phoenicians and Greeks. Their genetic legacy was never pure. It was always composite, always accumulating. When Jewish communities began dispersing across the Roman Empire after the destruction of the Second Temple in 70 CE, they carried that composite genetic heritage with them. Some moved west into North Africa and Spain. Others moved north into the Rhineland, into the German-speaking territories of medieval Europe, where they established the communities that became the Ashkenazi world. The Ashkenazi community that emerged in medieval Germany was not genetically the product of Germany. It was a Levantine population that had relocated to Germany and adopted. The German language and the German geography became part of their identity, but the DNA underneath remained older. Which brings us back to a man standing in a patent office in Bern in 1905, working through the equations that would become the special theory of relativity. Albert Einstein believed himself to be a product of European Jewish intellectual culture, and in every meaningful biographical sense, he was. He spoke German. He thought in German. He was educated in German and Swiss institutions. His cultural formation was entirely European, but his Y-chromosome carried a lineage that never originated in Europe. It had arrived there, it had adopted there, but its deepest roots traced back to the same lands that gave rise to the ancient Israelites, to the Berber populations of North Africa, to the populations of the Nile Valley and the Levantine coast. The irony is almost too precise to state plainly. The Nazis categorized Einstein as racially inferior, a Jew whose Jewish science was contaminating true German knowledge. They stripped him of citizenship, burned his books, and ultimately drove him out of the country.
Their ideology rested on the idea that Jewish people were foreign to Europe, alien to German culture. And in a genetic sense, a sense they could never have understood and would never have acknowledged, they were not entirely wrong. Einstein's paternal lineage was not of European origin, but the conclusion that followed from that fact was the exact opposite of what they believed. It was not a mark of inferiority, it was a record of one of the oldest human journeys on Earth.
There is another layer to the Einstein bloodline that no genetic test has ever resolved. In January 1902, before Einstein married Mileva Maric, she gave birth to a daughter. The child's name was Lisel. The circumstances of her birth were kept secret. Einstein and Mileva were unmarried and living in different cities, he in Bern, she in Novi Sad in what is now Serbia. The letters between them, discovered in 1986 in a collection held by Einstein's son Hans Albert, reveal that Lisel existed. They reveal that Einstein asked about her health, her development, her appearance, and then after September 1903, she disappeared entirely from the correspondence. No death certificate has ever been found. No adoption record has ever surfaced. The most widely accepted theory among historians is that Lisel died in infancy from scarlet fever, which swept through the region in late 1903. But some researchers have argued that she survived and was quietly placed with a Serbian family, that somewhere in the world there may be descendants of Albert Einstein who have never known it. If Lisel survived and had children, they would carry mitochondrial DNA traceable back through Mileva Maric's maternal line, a hidden biological branch of the most famous scientific mind of the 20th century existing in complete obscurity. The question of Einstein's hidden bloodline therefore operates on two levels simultaneously. There is the ancient level, the Y-chromosome haplogroup that traces his paternal ancestry not to medieval Germany, but to the ancient Levant and its surrounding regions, a genetic journey spanning tens of thousands of years. And there is the intimate level, a daughter who vanished from the historical record in 1903, whose fate remains genuinely unknown and whose potential descendants remain unidentified. Both questions lead to the same deeper issue, the gap between the story we tell about a person and the biological reality underneath it. Einstein's story was German, his DNA was ancient Levantine, his public life had no children out of wedlock, his private letters revealed a daughter he never publicly acknowledged. The man the world thinks it knows was, in both senses, only a partial picture. Not everyone finds the DNA findings as significant as the headlines suggest. Dr. Harry Oster, a geneticist at Albert Einstein College of Medicine in New York, the institution named in his honor, has cautioned against over-interpreting haplogroup results for historical figures. Haplogroups, he argues, tell you about one line of ancestry out of thousands. Einstein had 2 parents, 4 grandparents, 8 great-grandparents. The Y chromosome traces only one thread in that vast tapestry. The fact that his paternal line carried E1B1B says something about one ancestor in one ancient generation. It does not rewrite his identity as a German Ashkenazi Jew because that identity was shaped by culture, language, community, and history, not by a single genetic marker. That is a legitimate scientific caution. Population genetics is a field built on probability distributions, not certainties. Haplogroup assignments tell you about ancient migrations, but they do not map neatly onto modern ethnic or cultural identities. The Ashkenazi Jewish community itself is a product of so many historical confluences: Levantine founders, Roman-era diaspora, medieval European settlement, genetic drift in isolated communities, that reducing it to any single ancestral origin misses the complexity entirely. But the counterargument is equally compelling. The point is not that Einstein was secretly North African or secretly Levantine in any cultural sense. The point is that the story of human ancestry is always more layered than the official version. The Ashkenazi Jewish community built its identity in medieval Germany, but it carried genetic memory from a journey that began long before Germany existed. Einstein's E1B1B haplogroup is a trace fossil. It marks a path that his ancestors walked across millennia, from the valleys of the ancient Near East to the Rhineland to Swabia to Ulm, where on a cold March morning in 1879, it produced a child who would one day restructure humanity's understanding of space, time, and gravity.
The founding myth of the Ashkenazi world, like the founding myth of every people, was always a simplification. The reality was always more complicated, more ancient, and more connected to the rest of humanity than the story allowed. Einstein himself, who spent his life dismantling comfortable assumptions about how the universe worked, might have found that fitting. In the Einstein archives at Hebrew University in Jerusalem, there is a letter Einstein wrote near the end of his life to the philosopher Erich Gutkind in response to Gutkind's book on Jewish identity. The letter is famous among scholars for its complicated, almost tortured treatment of what it meant to be Jewish. He called the Jewish people his kin. He acknowledged belonging, but he also wrote that the word God was for him nothing more than an expression of human weakness, and that Jewish scripture, like all religious texts, was a collection of honored but primitive legends. He was a man who could feel the pull of identity without fully believing in its foundations. He knew belonging was real, even when its explanations were insufficient. And perhaps, though there is no way to know, he understood something about the distance between what a family says it is and what its blood actually remembers. The DNA does not change what Einstein achieved. It does not change what he suffered. It does not change the fact that a regime built on racial mythology drove him from his home because of his ancestry. But it does suggest something that Einstein, of all people, might appreciate: that the truth about where we come from is always older, stranger, and more difficult than the story we inherit. And that sometimes the most important discoveries are not the ones we set out to make, but the ones that find us, quietly, in the data we never thought to question.